I looked at the ad, unsure if my fever-addled brain was reading it right. Wanted. Someone to infect me with the COVID-19 virus. Must be verified as sick, have paperwork verifying illness no older than 2 days from today's date, and be willing to allow me to spend time near them. Will pay $500 for 8 hours in your company. Contraction of virus notwithstanding. Please email me immediately, with an email address attached. I had only been infected by the virus for the last 3 days, but I had been affected by it for the last 2 months. I had been laid off from work after a drop in profits had caused the store to go into bankruptcy. My boss had been very apologetic, but he still hadn't been able to keep the doors open. We had all hit the unemployment line after that, but unemployment wasn't as good as overtime. I'll admit, I had been living a little outside my means, and the bills were starting to pile up. Getting sick had ended my job search, and $500 was going to go a long way to settling my debt and keeping the lights on. And all that for letting a stranger hang out in my house for 8 hours sounded like a dream come true. I contacted him, and he offered to come over that very night, cash in hand. We discussed hours. I'm a dedicated night owl, and he agreed to come over at about 6 p.m. His knock dragged me out of my stupor at around 5:45, and I staggered up to get the door. I didn't expect to be greeted by a well-dressed man in his mid-30s. I'd expected a weirdo, maybe some disease fetishist who got off on being sick, but this guy was surprisingly well put together. He wore black slacks, a button-down shirt, no mask, and his brown hair was close-cropped with a square pair of little gold glasses that made him look like a banker. He shook my hand, something no one had done in a while, and took an envelope of money out of his pocket. He showed me 5 crisp $100 bills, and then I led him into the living room. He sat in my armchair, leaning in close as I sagged back onto the couch and stared at me intently. "So, what do we do now?" I asked. He shrugged. "Just whatever you usually do. Watch TV, play video games, whatever. Hopefully my proximity will be all it takes to get the disease, and I'll achieve my goal." "I had wondered about that," I said, sneezing into a Kleenex and wincing as he leaned in closer. "This disease is supposed to be pretty bad. Why exactly do you want it?" "I'd tell you, but honestly, it would sound crazy," he said with a chuckle. I shrugged. "It's not like we got anything else to do but watch Netflix for 8 hours. Tell me, it'll make the time pass." He glanced over at my bookshelf, eyes roaming as though he was looking for something particular, before settling on and taking a paperback from the middle. It was a newer book, Fields of the Foregone, and he nodded as he inspected the spine. He must have liked what he saw because he smiled and held the book out to me. "I see you're a fan of my work. I'll sign it for you if you want, but my books are part of the reason I'm here." I squinted at him. Are you Timothy Corvin? The guy who writes the Ghostgrass series?" He nodded. "Yep, 3-time New York Times bestseller." I gaped at him for a few seconds before asking my next question. "Why the hell are you at my apartment trying to get sick?" He smiled, but the smile was sad. "You could say that the writing is why I'm here." He sat down again and made himself comfortable before telling me the strangest story I'd ever heard. "I got sick about a month ago. It came on quickly, cough, fever, typical flu-like symptoms, but I assured my agent that it wouldn't be an issue. I'd finish my latest novel and have it on her desk by the end of the month. First couple of days weren't so bad. I was still lucid, and I managed to get some work done. I was trucking right along, making good progress, when the real sickness hit. Suddenly I was feverish, scatterbrained, and I could hardly focus long enough to get off the couch. I spent my days in a stupor, high on cold medicine and barely coherent. My nights consisted of rolling around in a fever-fueled daze that made me question whether I was dreaming or awake. I had these dreams, you see. I say dreams because I can't remember them, but I couldn't do anything but remember them then. I would sit on the couch and mumble about them all day, reeling through their world as I tried to wrap my head around them. I raised an eyebrow at him. "It sounds pretty bad. Sounds like you didn't get a lot done." "Oh, quite the contrary. The longer I raved about the stories, the more I started to write about them. Not so much writing, I guess. I read through my notes the other day, and it was more like drunken ramblings. At some point, I moved on to chronicling them. I would come to at my computer, banging away at a story, not sure what I was doing or how long I'd been doing it. The stories were great, but they were so far outside of what I normally did that I couldn't wrap my incoherent brain around them. As the fever started getting worse, I would slip into these fugue states and just write for hours on end. One day I came out of one and found I had an email from my agent. I had sent her a draft for one of the stories. I was so worried. These stories were really weird, completely batty, and I was afraid that she would drop me as a client if she read what my fever-swallowed brain had cooked up. He took a sip from his coffee then, wetting his pipes, and my own fever-addled brain became a little impatient. So, what did she think? Oh, she loved it. She said it was the most unique thing she had ever read, the most unique thing she had read in ages, and wanted to know when I was going to be done with it. Reading through what I had sent her and the stuff I was working on before I got better, I can see what she was talking about. It is both similar to so many things and completely different. It's a timeless story that sits completely outside of the normal processes. It seems to contain two antagonists and no hero, a war with nothing but loss and stakes that don't seem to make any sense. It was almost Lovecraftian, and I found myself as interested in hearing how it turned out as she was. But that was where the problem arose. He looked at my glass of water longingly, and I slid it across the table to him. If he wanted to get sick, then more power to him. He was paying after all, so he might as well get his money's worth. He reached out and brought it to his lips, throat working as he swallowed. I tried not to gag. There was probably backwash in that. My meds were squashing the fever that was keeping my brain in its altered state of mind. I was always careful never to ride it for too long, but the high was more than a little intoxicating. I would time travel in those moments, starting on my couch and coming to at my computer as I finished more pages than I'd ever done. I throttled back on my meds a little, wanting to stretch this out for as long as I could, but eventually my body started to get better. My fugue states became fewer and fewer. I found that I couldn't tap into that hidden world, and the story wasn't something that I could just make up as I went along. It was unknown, unheard of, and my mind couldn't begin to tap into that place by itself. My agent was wild to have more, wanting an ending, wanting a sequel, and that's when I started thinking about contracting it again. I lifted an eyebrow at him. I know that's what brought you here, that's what you told me on the phone, but I still have a hard time believing that you want this crap. It's miserable. Between the headaches and the near constant fever, I seem to mostly exist in a state of misery. Some people are experiencing it even worse than I have. What if you get the kind that's really bad and you're hospitalized? It seems like that would put a damper on your writing. He shrugged. That's the thing. Even when I'm experiencing the same symptoms as you, I still get the urge to write. I don't know if it's subconscious or what, but my brain takes over and forces my body to keep writing. Maybe it's not even my conscious mind. Maybe it's this place, and I've been tapped when I'm in these fugue states. I've had this thing 3 times now, you know. If I had had water in my hand, I would have probably did a spit take. 3 times? My God, you rarely hear of anybody getting it more than twice. After I got better the first time, I was struggling to keep up, he said, suddenly looking far away. I tried faking it, but it just wasn't the same. My agent started to notice. She started to send my stuff back with notes like, I need more of the voice you had in the first draft. I started getting desperate. She told me that she shared my notes with some of her colleagues, and they were very excited about how it was all coming together. So I started putting the pieces together and decided that I needed to recreate the situation. You needed to get sick again, I said. He nodded. I needed to get sick again. I started slowly, waiting in hospitals and waiting rooms, looking for sick people, but I became desperate after a while. I got lucky the first time, a chance encounter with a sick friend. One trip to their apartment, and I was back where I started, feverish and coughing on my couch as I waited for the time skips to start. Did they? Would I still be running the ad if they hadn't? This time, though, something was different. This time I was treated to some of the most vivid dreams I've ever had. I wasn't just hearing about my 2 antagonists. I could see them. I watched them play their shadow games, maneuver their pieces, snatch territory only to lose it again. All the while I was chronicling them. It became a mania for me. I refused to take anything to dull the fever this time, but it didn't seem to matter. After a week, my fever was abating, and I was back to trying to fake it. But I couldn't fake it. I wouldn't even try. I needed the dreams. I needed the visions. I needed the writing fits that I never remembered. That was when I started running the ads. The lady at the paper didn't want to run them at first. She said I was sick, but once I offered to pay her triple the going rate, she caved. As I watched him talk about it, I reflected that he did look pretty sick. Not physically, but mentally, I mean. He looked like an addict describing his favorite drug. As he talked, he scratched at his arm, his face taking on a smiling rictus as he described the visions. I began to wonder just how this disease, or maybe it was the story that had affected him. I wanted to tell him to leave off for his own good, but I really did need the money. I've sunk nearly $5,000 into getting this disease. Did I tell you that? Every time I post the ad, someone responds. After so many, though, my body has built up antibodies to it, and every time I get it, it's a little less effective. The last time I contracted it, I barely had it for a week. I was so anxious to get any work out of it that I don't think I got more than 30 pages the whole week. 30 pages? I gasped. I was no writer, but that seemed like a prolific amount of work for a sick person. I know, what a disgrace. The first time I was nearly averaging 30 pages a day, but after the first time I never managed it again. You were getting that much a day? His eyes glazed a little. He didn't seem pleased with what he saw, and he looked at my popcorn ceiling. I see them constantly. I simply can't make sense of it on my own. I can't convey something like storms battling for supremacy, tectonic plates crashing against each other as they try to change the land. The fugues allow me to tap into something primal that could understand these ideas. My puny lizard brain just can't make anything out of it. You know, reading these things I've written, understanding only enough of what I've written, scares me a little. How much of your book have you written? I asked, not sure I wanted an answer. He scratched again, still uncomfortable, but wanting to discuss his drug of choice nonetheless. I've written 5 books. I've cataloged the lives of these two from the moment of their birth to the very last encounter they had directly. I gaped at him. He was talking about 5 books in what must have been a matter of months. I couldn't even consider something like that, and I began to wonder how large they were. The pages, the volume he was talking about per day surely meant that these were no small books. He didn't seem to understand where these stories were coming from either, which made them all the more mysterious and unknown. Can you tell me about them? He gave me a dead-eyed look, and I almost regretted asking. It's not something people really want to know in the end. This little experiment started as a way to write the next great fantasy series, but my agent stopped returning my emails about 3 weeks ago. The last 2 endeavors have been solely so I could learn how it ends, how we end. We? Humanity. We are the ultimate prize that these 2 creatures fight over. More specifically, they fight over the right to subjugate and entertain themselves with us. We see their battles as normal. We see their battles as nothing but the changing of the seasons, but they see them as nothing short of war. I can tell you, but you won't want to know once I'm done. I didn't really want to know anymore, but I felt like I had to know. In the end, my curiosity was stronger than my fear. He spent the next 10 hours telling me about the battle between the Green Man and the Pale Lady. He told me of their beginnings in Strange, their emergence, and their eventual exile, and how they came to be on this plane of existence in the first place. He told me about the Brandylow, the servants of the Pale Lady, and the numerous agents of the Green Man. He told me how this green warrior was worshipped as a pagan deity, how he took his sacrifices, and how he sought out those who ran. It's funny how 10 hours can seem like a half hour when someone is telling you about the eldritch deities that you never knew you wanted to know about. When the alarm on my phone went off, reminding me to take my meds, I realized that it was 6 a.m. and the sun was coming up. Timothy got up, checking his own phone, and seemed to realize that he'd been talking all night. Seems I've gone over my time a little. Here, as promised, he said, taking out the money and handing it to me as he left. Wait, I said, dropping the envelope and coming shakily from the couch. How does it end? He looked back and shrugged. Hopefully I'll find out. If I do, I'll let you know." Then he left, and I wouldn't hear from him for another 3 months. Well, I'd never hear from him again, but he would make good on his promise. I felt better by the end of the week, my fever breaking and my headache getting better and better. I finally acquired a negative test and started looking for work again. I got lucky. The bar up the road was hiring, and they needed someone to start right away. They had only recently been allowed to reopen, and the bartender was working double duty as the bar back to help out. Before I knew it, I was bussing tables and hauling kegs like an old pro. I enjoyed the work, though it wasn't something I'd ever done before, and it felt nice to get back to work after a long absence. Then, one afternoon, I was helping my boss open, flipping on the TV and preparing to tune in to one of the sports channels like I often did. That's when I saw the little squib on the news that made me stop. The city is mourning the death of local writer Timothy Corvin, who died of COVID-related symptoms in St. Graham's this morning. Mr. Corvin, the writer of the Ghostgrass series, is survived by his father and his older sister. Service will be held Tuesday for his friends and family at... I couldn't believe it. The guy had been in my house not even a month ago. Had I killed him? Had he contracted his fatal disease from me? I had to sit down. I didn't know what to make of it. My boss must have noticed that something was off because he tried to send me home, wondering if I still had some latent symptoms of being sick. I told him I was fine, though, and I went back to work. As I worked, I wondered if he'd discovered the end he was looking for. I got my answer in the mail a couple of months later. A package was waiting on the stoop. I hadn't ordered anything, and the return address was from Samantha Drummond. The delivery address was mine, though, so I brought it inside and opened it. Inside was a manuscript, bound in twine with no title across the surface. On the top of the journal was a typed note from Mrs. Drummond informing me of her package's purpose. "Hello, my brother requested that I send this to you after he passed. He was very adamant that it be placed in your care. All the best, Mrs. Drummond." I lifted out the journal, opening the front page and bearing a message written in a shaky hand. "I found the end. Let's hope it helps you after I'm gone. I've been sitting here looking at the book for close to an hour, not sure whether I should read it or just burn it. If the beings Timothy had talked about had been using his infected body as a mouthpiece, I'm not sure I want to open my mind to them. This book contains their history, contains their past, present, and future, and this knowledge was gained at the cost of a life. Will they come to infect me if I subject myself to this arcane wisdom? That knowledge scares me more than a little as I put the journal back in the box and carry it to my room. I decided to put it in the closet for now. Some things are better left unknown, I think. I'm not sure which was weirder, the fact that Dad had a hole in his head, or the fact that he was just so unimpressed with it. Dad had come home from his job at the steel mill, just as he had 1,000 times. We heard him sit his hard hat down by the door as he stripped out of his jumpsuit before coming to dinner. Mom had meatloaf on the table with potatoes and peas, Dad's favorite, and we waited patiently for him to arrive like we always did. If this sounds weird to you, that's because it should. Dad had a strange idea that he should go to work, Mom should stay at home and keep the kids, and that everyone should look like an episode of Leave It to Beaver when he got home. I remember for a while, Mom met him at the door with a cold glass of beer when he came home. He eventually told her to stop so that the dust from the mill didn't get on her. It was odd, but Dad paid the bills, and that's how he liked it, so that's what we did. Mom had gotten half of her welcome home greeting out before it curdled in her throat. My brother had already seen it, but I was still looking at the TV around the corner and hadn't seen it yet. MTV was playing a song by a band I liked, and I looked up at Mom to ask if I could use the bathroom when I noticed Dad's head. Dad, meanwhile, had sat down at the table like nothing was amiss, opening his napkin and putting it on his lap. He was hungry from a day at work, and he had just started asking us about our own day when he noticed our horrified looks. "What? What's the matter?" All three of us were speechless for a moment. How did he not realize what had us all so gobsmacked? Surely he had to feel that. He had to realize what had happened to him. There was no way that a person could be so oblivious of something like that. In the center of Dad's forehead was a hole big enough to stick your pinky finger into. It wasn't like a wound. Wounds usually bleed or appear red or scabby. This one was simply a black hole in his forehead. The edges looked a little ragged, but that more reminded me of a hole that someone had drilled into the pavement than a wound. As strange as the hole was, the fact that it didn't seem to have an exit point was even stranger. "Honey," Mom asked, trying to be diplomatic about the situation, Did something happen at work today?" "No," Dad said, looking at her speculatively. "Well, Stubbins was changing the no-slip grating on the walkways, but that's really not that weird, I guess." Are you sure nothing odd happened today?" she asked, trying to tiptoe around the matter so she didn't upset him. Sometimes Dad could have a temper, and none of us wanted to see it. "I guess, maybe," he seemed to think about it. "There was this guy I bumped into on the sidewalk. I fell down, and he helped me up, but it was nothing." When she continued to look at him skeptically, he set his fork down angrily and glowered at her. "Look, Martha, if you have something to ask, then just go ahead and ask it. I'm trying to eat here." "Dad, there's a huge hole in your freaking head." I was never what you'd call subtle. Dad wrinkled his eyebrows at me. "What in the hell are you talking about?" "There's a hole in your forehead. How do you not feel that? Are you trying to be funny? 'Cause you know I don't like jokes." Despite his gruff tone, though, he began feeling around his forehead, as if trying to find the source of discomfort. He seemed half-hearted, like he was just doing it as a favor by looking at it in the first place. But when his fingers touched the ragged edges of the hole, he shuddered a little. I didn't think it had hurt him, not really. It was more like the shudder you get when you have an itch and you scratch it. He inspected it with his fingers for a moment, before getting up to look at it in the bathroom mirror. The three of us hovered just outside the door as he looked at it in the mirror, and we must have looked like some old comedy routine as we waited for his prognosis. After a few minutes of poking and prodding at it, he finally turned away and walked past us, leaving us just standing there. We found him at the kitchen table, eating his dinner like any other night. "Sit down, your mother's meatloaf is getting cold," he told us, once he noticed we were there. "Dad," I started, but Mom put a hand on my shoulder. "Harold, there's a hole in your head. Don't you think we should go to the hospital?" Dad turned his emotionless gaze on her, making it clear that he didn't want to talk about it. When we didn't move, he growled in his throat in a deep, phlegmy way. "Doctor won't be able to do anything but poke at it and charge me an arm and a leg. Not going to no doctor. Now sit down and eat." Then he went back to eating, ignoring us until we returned to the table and ate as well. We all tried not to notice the hole as we ate, but it was hard to ignore. As we sat and watched TV that night, the TV screen seemed to reflect off that dark hole. Mom laughed every time the audience did, but Dad never did. Well, that's not entirely true. Dad did this thing when he found something funny. 1 part chuckle and 9 parts phlegmy rumble. When I was a kid, I had asked Mom once why Dad never laughed or smiled, and she told me that he laughed often and smiled daily. It's just hard to tell with your father. He's not quite as obvious about it as the rest of us are. After that, I started paying more attention to Dad, and I'd come to the point where I could pick up on the subtle twitches at the corner of his mouth, the gravelly rumble when he chuckled, the minute crinkling at the edges of his beetle-black eyes. They helped me tell when my dad was in a good mood, and when he felt less like hitting and more like patting, when you could ask him for a favor, when it was best to leave him alone. It was a talent my younger brother never learned, and it was a mistake that often earned him a cuff upside the back of the head when he'd try to hit Dad up for money. Dad was enjoying the byplay tonight as Raymond bemoaned everything from his mother to his job, but my mind was still firmly fastened on the hole. As I watched it, I almost fancied that I could see it expand and retract as though it were breathing. I told myself it was the light from the TV, but the longer I watched, the surer I became that it was moving. It was like a ragged mouth, pulling in and pushing out air. It was subtle, like my father's moods, and the longer I watched, the more apparent it became. When my father turned his gaze on me, I realized he had caught me staring. "Either go to bed or stop staring at me. You're creeping me out." I pushed off the love seat and went to my room. I knew I wouldn't be able to focus on anything as long as that hole was on display. The next few days were uneventful, I guess, but I noticed that Dad started wearing a hat when he went outside. I wished he would wear it inside too, because the hole seemed to always be watching me whenever I was around him. It wasn't, of course, because it didn't have any eyes, but I could feel that itchy feeling you sometimes get when someone's staring at you. It looked like it was getting bigger too. But if it pained Dad, he didn't say anything about it. He mostly ignored it, his only exception to ignoring it being the hat he wore outside. Dad was stubborn, but he wasn't foolish. Dad was a sensible person who liked to keep attention off himself. Over the next 10 days, the hole got noticeably bigger. When we'd first seen it, it had been maybe big enough to put your pinky finger inside. Now I could have easily put several in there, and still he refused to go to the hospital. Mom tried to coax him, but he said it wasn't worth bothering a doctor over. If it was bad, it would hurt, and it doesn't. If it means to go away, it'll do it on its own. He went to work, came home, watched TV, and all the time that hole continued to grow. I found myself looking at my father more and more often, that gaping chasm seeming to look at me, even when his hat was on. I started having dreams about that hole, and in my dreams it oozed and bled, and a single eyeball rolled around to look at me. No matter what Dad was doing in the dream, that eye stared at me until I came awake, gasping. Then one day, he came to breakfast and the hole had taken in his eyebrows. It wasn't a hole now, it was more like a pit, a crater that just so happened to sit in the middle of my father's head. Mom was left with an egg halfway to her mouth as she stared into that gaping void. We could all see it breathing now, the push and pull of its respiration as it drew in its terrible breath. Dad sat eating his own eggs and grits, pretending like nothing was wrong, but it was clear that he felt it too. He refused to answer any of us when we called his name, and left for work with his breakfast only half eaten. I noticed that when he came home from work that day, there was a different hard hat on the table in the entryway. The hard hat had a slant to it and would better cover the hole. Dad may act like nothing was wrong, but I couldn't. I started avoiding him. I would come down to breakfast late since I knew he'd be at work. I would make excuses to stay out so I could miss dinner. I did any number of other things to avoid being in the house, but it hardly seemed to matter. I had begun to hear some kind of strange whispering as I lay in bed at night, and it permeated my dreams as the eye inside began to whisper words I didn't understand. The words were alien, harsh, and unwantable, but I felt I knew their meaning. My sleep became as ragged as my father's moods, and if I hadn't been barely into my senior year of high school, I think I would have moved out. Then about a month and a half after the spot appeared, Dad didn't come down for breakfast. Mom told us that Dad wasn't feeling well. She said he must have gotten sick in the night, but the way her eyes looked told me something beyond sickness was at play. He didn't go to work that day, and unknown to us, he would never go back to work again. Mom moved into the guest bedroom, and I wouldn't find out till later it was because Dad had locked the door and wouldn't let her in. We could hear him in there bumping around. Mom would leave food in the hallway, but we never saw him take it. This went on until one morning when I forgot my notebook upstairs. I'd been heading to school, leafing through my bag, when I realized I'd forgotten my biology notebook. I had a test that day, and I wanted to study before class. I was halfway up the stairs when I heard the door to my parents' bedroom open. I stopped halfway up, not sure whether I should continue or not. None of us had seen Dad since he went into hiding, and my brother and I had been very curious about what was happening with the hole. I put my fingers on the carpet and scrambled slowly up the stairs, peeking over the edge of the stairs as I heard the scrape of silverware being bumped. I could see my father's back, clad in a bathrobe and knee socks, as he bent over for the day's breakfast tray that my mom had left for him. He seemed to be having trouble grabbing it, and his hands threatened to knock over the juice that she had set beside the bowl of oatmeal. Then he stood up, and I had to put my hand over my mouth as he came into view. The top of his head looked like nothing so much as one of those cartoon holes they used to trap each other. It was a swirling black vortex that looked a mile deep, and as he turned to go back into the room, I could see the hole was like some kind of optical illusion. It was exactly as deep on the other side as it was on the back. He turned and took the tray back into the bedroom, but when he bumped the tray on the corner of the door, I realized why we had heard him banging around so much the last few days. In my dream, the hole always had an eye, but in reality, it had stolen my father's sight. The dreams became different after that. Every night I dreamed that my family was eating around the breakfast table. My brother sat on my left, my mom sat on my right. Dad sat across from me, bent over his breakfast as usual. They all sat eating food from a massive pile, their breakfast more like a buffet. I seemed to be the only one paying attention to the strange creature wearing father's clothes, and the food he ate was pushed into the circle hole atop his head. As I watched, the eye emerged again, but it wasn't alone this time. The eye was in a face, and the face was long and terrible. The skin was tan and leathery, like a hide left out in the sun too long. The hair was white and fine, like a corpse's. The teeth were jagged and yellow, its eyes the cataract threads of the chronically blind, and when its face rolled around to look at me, I would shake as its lips rose in an almost comical grin. As everyone ate, the mouth opened, and a low whisper began to assault my ears. Every night, that whisper became a little louder, and over time, I came to understand the words, Shally shally may ray, fori fori may gra, lee raleigh grega, su raleigh drema. The words slid into my ears like slugs, coating my brain in the forbidden knowledge they possessed. I wasn't sure what the dream meant, but I knew that they were meant for me. Was this the thing that had been staring at me the whole time? Was this the reason I had felt watched? As the dreams continued, I began humming or reciting the words it spoke to myself during the day. I would catch myself making little rhymes out of it, and they were never far from my mind. It was almost soothing to speak those words, a balm to the terrible dreams and the terrible fear that wormed its way through my mind. I knew what it wanted me to do, and one night, I did my part. I needed to use the bathroom in the middle of the night, my bladder full to bursting. I was leaving the bathroom when I noticed that the door to my parents' room was open for the first time in a long time. There was a noise coming from inside, and it sounded pained. I thought maybe one of the dogs had gotten in there and gotten hurt, but I think even then, I knew what I would find. Dad was on the ground, his swirling head practically hyperventilating as it pulled in and out. The swirls had taken in Dad's shoulders and the top of his chest. He was lying on the floor, flopping around as his arms protruded from the vortex. I reached down and helped him sit with his back to the bed. He couldn't talk, probably couldn't even see, but he seemed to understand that I was there to help him. As I looked at the swirling mass, though, I felt the words come to my lips. I don't know if they were intentional, but I know they were the words that needed to be said. Shally shally rayma, fori fori megra, lee raleigh grega, su raleigh drema. As the words fell from me, I saw something swirling in the mass of shadows. I was worried it would be the huge eye, like the one I'd seen in my dreams, but I was even more afraid that it would be the ancient face that I often saw amidst the vortex. As it swirled and thrummed, I could see the white hair beginning to sprout from the depths. The head was coming on fast, and as those eyes emerged from the depths, I could see the corners cast up in a smile. My shaky legs took me away from him with small, stuttery steps. His face came free of the murk, but it wasn't done yet. As his head slid free, a withered form emerged beneath it. He was naked, looking like some kind of wizened mummy, as his leathery skin slid from the dark pool. Below the dark pit that had made up my father's head, his body began to shrivel up like a 4th of July firework, becoming blackened embers before my eyes. The more of that evil thing that came free, the less of him there was, and when his withered feet touched down on the soft carpet of my parents' bedroom, what remained of my father simply blew away. The old man reached down for the grubby bathrobe that Dad had been wearing, and tittered as he pulled it around himself. "Took you long enough, but I guess I can't be upset. You and your father have served me well, though you never realized you were doing it. Your reward is not sharing in his fate. Your punishment is knowing you are responsible for my return to this world. What you do with these gifts is up to you." Then he left, just walked out of our house and into the night. As the sun comes up over my mother's kitchen, I realize I've been writing this since I managed to get back to my feet and walk shakily down the stairs. I've been trying to write down as much of this experience as possible so I won't forget any of it, but it's so weird, and it's hard to put it all into words. What the hell was that thing that ultimately killed my father? Did it make the hole in his head? Why him? As I sit here watching the sun come up, I realize I may never know. Grandma and I have been roommates for about a year now. That probably sounds pretty weird for a 23-year-old girl to say, but I have to say it's been a pretty great arrangement. My girlfriend and I have lived in the apartment for about 3 years now, both of us deciding that campus housing wasn't for us. Grandma may be sort of a new arrival, but I gotta say, she's probably about the best roommate I've ever had. She cooks, she cleans, doing so despite Regina and I telling her that we don't expect her to, and our laundry always seems to find its way into the closet once the hamper is full. She was one of those hippie types who missed the 60s and is incredibly chill. I don't know many other grandmothers who like to sit on the back porch at night with us and have a beer and smoke a bowl. She doesn't judge me for what most people over 50 would consider an unnatural relationship either, which means the world to Regina and I. She told my girlfriend many times that she considers her a second granddaughter, and the people in the community tell me how cool it is to have someone like my grandma in our lives. Most nights, while we sit on the porch, having a beer or two and passing around some stuff that's not strictly legal here, Grandma would tell us how this reminds her of how she and her friends acted when they were young. My friends and I would sit on the veranda and drink wine sometimes. The nights in Greece are warm, and we used to just sit in our shifts and tease the boys when they came by. It was a marvelous time to grow up. The war was a distant memory, at least for those of us who were young, and life was full of possibilities. Grandma grew up in Greece, missing the end of the war by 3 years, and she often talked lovingly about her time there. She was never very clear about where she grew up, but it must have been near the water because many of her stories involved she and her friends swimming or going to the beach with boys they fancied. She'd met Grandpa at 17, him studying abroad and her waiting tables in a cafe. She said it had been love at first sight, and he'd asked her to marry him once his time in Greece was over. He brought me back to California with him, and to me, it was the grandest place in all the world. She often told us stories from when she was young, and Regina and I usually found ourselves laughing at the antics of her younger self. She and her friends had sounded less like a group of young girls and more like a group of street toughs. Grandma told us how they had done everything from teasing boys into fighting to stealing a scooter and fleeing from the police. If it hadn't been for Great Aunt Sophie and Uncle Martin, Grandma might have been a full-fledged criminal instead of a sometimes rapscallion. They had all been happy stories, at least until tonight. Regina had come home from work, and I could tell that something was off right away. Regina's in nursing school and often has to work in the ER as part of her studies. They pay them for their time, of course, but it's expected that students will pursue jobs in the medical field so they can gain experience. Regina is usually full of stories about how she helped clear the airway of a baby, or how she got a patient to tell her that the prescription drug they had taken was more recreational than they'd let on. Grandma and I had already started our little revel without her, and she took the beer I handed her with a shaky hand. I watched her sip it for a few seconds, hands jittering, before finally asking her what had happened. They brought in a lady today. She'd been stabbed over a dozen times, and they said she had no pulse. They wheeled her in on a gurney and asked if I'd notify the morgue that they had a Jane Doe to go back. I nodded. Not your first dead body, babe. Regina shook her head. I turned to get the phone, the paramedics walking away for a moment as a call came in over the radio, and when I turned back, the woman had sat up. It was a little scary, but I thought it was just gas in the corpse or something. I turned back to the phone, and then the gurney started creaking as she climbed off. She went walking up the hall like a ghost in her sheet, and when I started screaming, the paramedics came back in a hurry. It seemed funny to me, a lady in a sheet shuffling up the hallway towards freedom, but I guess it was a little different when you were living it. Turns out she had a very weak pulse, and when she'd come in, she'd attempted to run. Her heart stopped before she got to the door, and she died right there in the ambulance bay. How terrible, I said, my image less funny now. She must have been searching for her killer, just like poor old Victor, Grandma said, patting Regina on the arm. Who, I asked, not sure who this Victor was that Grandma was talking about. Victor Mustrov, she elaborated. He was a handsome young man in the village I grew up in. He was quite a bit older than me, around 22 when I was 13, but he was so handsome. It was a shame what happened to him, but it was even worse what happened afterwards. I leaned forward on the cheap plastic chair I was sitting on and asked her to tell us. She nodded. It's a little scary, though. At least, it gave me a shiver when I was young. As she spoke, her eyes seemed to cloud a little, her mind traveling back over the years and the miles. It all started after Victor's murder. They didn't realize it was a murder right away, of course. Poor old Victor was a carpenter, he and his brother Isaac. The two worked for his father, Marcus, but it was pretty clear who Marcus favored. Victor was set to take over his father's operation when his father grew too old to work, and Victor had let this and his charm go to his head. He was vain, we all knew it, but he was charming too, and his vanity was really no big deal. He dated many girls in the village, and my friends and I were even taken with him. Then, one day, he went missing. We all searched for him, the whole town coming together to look for a favored son. Isaac came with us, saying that his brother had left the job site after saying he had to go do something. We searched the woods and the hills and everywhere around the village, but we couldn't find his car or Victor. He was simply gone. A week went by with no sign of him, but most of us just assumed he had taken after some woman from out of town. Victor was prone to that sort of behavior, but this was the longest he had ever been gone. Isaac went right on working, like his older brother wasn't just gone. Marcus, however, was inconsolable. We saw him many evenings sitting on the porch, sot drunk and weeping openly. Isaac would often be trying to console him, but Marcus wanted nothing from that one. My friends and I changed sides of the street when we walked past Marcus's house, not wanting to get drawn into their arguments. Then, one night, someone said they saw something strange. I heard it around the market first. It was an older woman, someone's grandmother, who said they had been walking home when they encountered someone they thought was Victor. He was staggering on a badly twisted leg, kicking up dust from the cobbles with every shaky step. His clothes, however, looked like the kind of garments a dandy might wear. His vest was filthy. His pants left a trail of water when he walked. I called his name, thinking he might have been in an accident, and when he turned around, I thought for certain I would faint. The hair was wet and lank, the curtains seeming to spin in slow motion, and then I could see the weeping crater that was his face. He had no eyes, no nose, no mouth, and the holes where they had been did little but gurgle and wheeze. I screamed, turning away in my fright to clutch the edge of the fountain, and when I looked back, it was gone. I scoffed at her story as the other old ladies clutched their rosaries and told her she was lucky to be alive. Old women often made things up like this, I thought in my youthful wisdom, and went back to shopping. It was likely just some beggar or a scarred-up vagrant. I told my friends about it that night as we sat smoking on my mother's veranda, and we all laughed at how silly she had been. When Julia saw him that night on her way home, it changed our outlook a bit. Julia was supposed to spend the night, but she ran home after dark to get something. She was gone for a little while, longer than I had thought she would be, and when she came back, she was out of breath and sweating, close to hyperventilating. It took us quite a while to calm her down, but finally she told us that she had seen the man from the old woman's story. It was just like she said, she gasped, her face fearful as she recalled it. I was going home to get my records, and when I came to the plaza near the fountain, I heard a weird dragging sound. He came out of an alley, and I turned to see his smushed face looking straight at me. I ran as fast as I could, but it seemed that no matter where I went, he was limping close by. Finally, I hid in the market until he shambled away, but I was terrified that he would find me. We consoled her, trying to keep her quiet so that she didn't disturb my parents with such talk, and eventually she went to sleep as her fear began to ebb. The strange, shambling man was all anyone could talk about in the coming days. People saw him walking through the streets, shambling along as though looking for someone. He would always be gone whenever a group came to see him, but the longer it lasted, the more people started traveling in groups. There was a lot of speculation about who it was and what they were after, and some people thought it might be Victor. Chief among them was Miss Treda, a woman believed to be a strega. She claimed that Victor was seeking his killer and wanted to find his body so that they could use cruentation to find him. She had conducted things like this before, offering to help the police if they would let her display the body, but she had been turned down many times. Cruentation was something old that she believed in, and it seemed to associate guilt with the blood coming from a dead body when the murderer touched it. No one really believed in it anymore. It was an ancient practice. And besides, how would you collect everyone up to touch the body? Our town was home to hundreds, and collecting them all would be quite an effort. Most people rolled their eyes at Miss Trada, but I think a lot of them secretly believed that the shambling specter was Victor. When it broke into Marcus's house and scared him half to death, many more people thought it might also be Victor. A few people whispered in the market the next day that the spirit had come after Marcus, and there were some rumblings about checking if he was the murderer. Miss Trada had started offering money to anyone who could find Victor's body. Some young men had started roving the streets at night to see if they could follow the specter back to his place of rest, but it seemed to avoid them as easily as it avoided the constables that hunted for it. This went on for several weeks, and it was very exciting times. People sat and made up wild rumors about the stranger and what it wanted, and my friends and I were no exception. Then one night it all came to an end. I remember being woken up by someone screaming. Our house wasn't too far from Isaac's house, and when I went to my window I could see the corpse as it carried him through the streets. It had him by the front of his shirt, Isaac beating at him as it carried him towards the plaza where he had first been seen. Others were looking out their windows, watching the grim procession as it made its way through the streets. Despite the horror, many of us put on our robes and shoes and ran to see where the shade was taking poor Isaac. As he came into the plaza, it was hard for the crowd to ignore the blood that was oozing from him, his pores excreting this thick and tarish juice. Miss Trada, standing amongst the crowd by then, didn't have to tell them what that meant. Isaac had already begun confessing his sin again and again for all to hear. Upon hearing him confess, it was as though the shade folded in on itself. He collapsed, dropping Isaac and laying dead on the cobbles of the plaza. The constables arrested him immediately, and I watched him beg for forgiveness as they hung him 3 months later. His lawyer drug out the proceedings, claiming that evidence provided by a corpse was not the modern justice that he was about, but the number of people who had heard him confess in the plaza was inarguable. Isaac himself pled guilty, despite his lawyer pleading for him to be silent, and he refused to leave jail until he was led to the gallows. I heard he told people that Victor's shade visited his window every night, and he was afraid to leave the jail, fearing it might come after him. 100 people saw Victor's corpse bleed that night, 100 or more at least, and they all lived in fear of the shade for nearly a month. That was thankfully the only time I saw a corpse walk. Regina and I looked at each other, both of us trying to see if the other really believed her. As I lay here now, Regina snoring thinly beside me, I can say that, whether I believe or not, it's a story that'll follow me for quite some time.
If walls could talk, Joshua mumbled under his breath as he walked through the ancient old arches of the hotel. Approaching the wide check-in desk was like stepping back in time, but the image was ruined by the girl with her phone out and her AirPods stuffed in her ears. She was smacking her gum and perusing Face Space or Tic Tacs or whatever people her age did. Joshua hadn't really had time for any of that in a while. He hadn't seemed to have much time for anything these days. The girl at the desk looked young enough to be his daughter, and her smile was that perfect mix of customer service charm and barely masked indifference. "Good afternoon, sir. How can I help you?" Joshua looked up at her, and she must have seen something that spooked her in his hollow eyes, because he saw some of that indifference slip into something resembling concern. Not concern for him. That would have been a little too genuine an emotion to show a stranger. She was concerned that he might be a weirdo. She had clearly been warned about spotting weirdos. The hotel likely got its share of rent and ditchers or guys who wound up naked in the hot tub at 3 a.m., and she was on the lookout for trouble before it reared its head. The hotel manager likely had them keeping an eye out for these sort of weirdos who wanted to become permanent residents. If she saw that on his face, he knew he'd be screwed. Joshua tried to fix his face, but it was a struggle. "Checking in," he said, handing her his credit card and reservation paperwork. She looked at the paperwork as if the concept were foreign to her, before turning to the computer and clicking away at the register. He figured it was likely something that she didn't deal with regularly. The Leaser Moor was not some posh establishment, not some trendy spot that housed celebrities or jet-setters. It was an old hotel that attracted tourists and people who liked to bask in historic places. That's why Susan had come here, after all. She'd been here to photograph the hotel for a travel magazine, her 4th assignment as a freelancer, and her last. She pulled him up, and Joshua saw her bite her lip when the room number popped up. "Ooh, that's gotta be a mistake. Sorry, sir, but that room isn't one we usually rent out." "I'm aware. That's why I requested it." She looked shocked, like she didn't know what to say. "I hate to tell you this, but someone went missing in there pretty recently." She had pitched her voice low like it was a rat problem, or some mold that could have been steam cleaned out. Joshua wanted to be angry. He wanted to tell her that he knew someone had gone missing in there, and that 6 months and 5 days wasn't recent to him. 6 months and 5 days was when his world had crumbled, and it was a day he would never forget. He wanted to tell her that his wife had not been some rat infestation or a mold colony that could be cleaned, poisoned, or time erased. He wanted to tell her all these things in a flurry of anger and hatred, but he knew she wouldn't understand. "I've been informed. I like to stay in rooms like that and try to gauge paranormal happenings. It's a hobby of mine. Since I was in the city anyway, I figured I would take that room." The young woman sighed as she finished checking him in. "That's good. She just thought he was a weirdo." Weirdo was fine. A weirdo might set up some cameras, pull out a ghost box or an Ouija board, light some candles, and pretend to be a ghostbuster or a medium for a few days before leaving. One look at the suitcase probably told her that he had brought all his toys with him so he could play pretend, but she had no idea what games he intended to play. There was only one tool in that bag, and it wasn't for playing. "And you're all set," she said, handing him his key card. "Please enjoy your stay at the Leaser Moor." Her smile was back, that fabricated grin that hid her disinterest. She just wanted him to leave so she could get back to Snapchatting or Twittering or whatever she was doing. She'd have something to tell her friends about tomorrow when she came in for her morning shift and heard about the mess he'd left in his room. Joshua pushed the button for the elevator and rode it up to the 7th floor. The hallway was done in that early 80s cinema style that made you think the floor was furry or sticky. The carpet pattern shifted in slightly nauseating diamonds as he walked down the hall towards his room. The thought that this would be the last thing he ever saw was a little disappointing, but that was reality. With any luck, his daughter wouldn't get his letter until Monday, not unless the post office near the college was feeling excessively ambitious. It would be too late for him to stop him either way. Joshua had laid out everything he needed to, explaining that he couldn't live without her mother, and that if her spirit resided somewhere in this room, he wanted to be with her. She could have his money, his savings, the car, the house, and anything else he owned, so she could finish school and make something of herself. All he wanted was Susan. He came to the door of room 712 much too soon, and as he slid the key into the lock, He glanced at the room where his wife had spent her last few hours of life. As the door came open, he was a little disappointed to find that it was just another bland hotel room. 2 beds, a dresser, an old TV that looked ready for the dump, a flimsy-looking chair, a nightstand that doubtlessly held a Bible, and the wall, whose color scheme sat somewhere between warm brown sugar and runny crap. Had this really been Susan's final destination? Had these uninteresting walls been the last thing she'd seen before leaving this room for the last time? Joshua set his suitcase down and took a seat on the bed, suddenly hoping not. Let her have seen the sights, taken a meal, and taken her final breath anywhere but here. The sun set outside the window as he sat on the bed, casting shadows across the room. As the darkness came to fill the empty space, Joshua became aware of strange patterns on the wall. The smears seemed to move as the shadows became gantries, and some looked eerily like faces. Suddenly the room was far too crowded, the multitudes watching him from the walls of the room, their judgment palpable. Joshua could hear the nightlife waking up, the people rumbling from the street below as the cabs and the music created a strange cacophony. He opened the suitcase and pulled out the gun, deciding that this would be a fine time to do it. Every minute he put it off was another chance for something to go wrong. It also gave his courage a chance to slip. If Kara got the letter and he couldn't follow through, he'd be spending the foreseeable future in a mental facility. Having to sit in the sterile room on a paper gown, orderlies medicating him to the point of catatonia, would be worse than death. As he set the cold barrel against his head, he whispered a final apology to Susan as his finger hovered over the trigger. "Stop!" It took every ounce of trigger control not to blow the top of his head off by accident. Joshua turned, his eyes growing wide as he recognized the face that had yelled at him. He wasn't sure what he had expected, a ghost or a manifestation, or maybe just a final mental break that would prove less supernatural and more existential. But he never expected to see one of the slightly expressive wall faces staring at him with panic. It reminded him of a mannequin's face, featureless and barely expressive. But as he watched it, it spoke again, and he heard the voice of his dead wife coming from the bland wallpaper. "Please, I can't watch you kill yourself." Joshua crawled across the bed, his shocked face locked onto the unremarkable one looking at him from the wall. Susan? The eyeless face stared at him as he got closer, and despite being devoid of anything remotely close to features, he began to see his dead wife's face beneath it. The scar on her cheek that she'd gotten in high school, the small nose he'd loved to kiss the tip of, the eyes that were slightly too close together, her lips that looked just as full and sensuous as they had before she'd left. The closer he looked, the more he saw. The more he saw, the closer he came. Is it you?" "It is," she said, the corner of her mouth pulling up as she studied him. "It's good to see you." "But how?" he said, stuttering as he leaned off the bed, closer and closer to that wall of perpetual faces. I don't know," she whispered, her lips forming the words delicately. "I woke up to see a face on the wall looking back at me, and as we stared at each other, it began to speak." He leaned in closer, slipping off the bed as his knees brought him closer to the spot on the wall where Susan's face lay. "He asked what I was doing in his room, and after I explained that I had rented it from the hotel, he told me how he was staying here on a business trip when he had seen the faces as well. They all live here, Josh. Once I became part of them, I got to know them and heard their stories. They were all once people who stayed in this very room, people on vacation, people on business, people with families, people estranged, all seeking purpose in something and finding it here. Joshua crawled on his knees like a penitent before an idol, but his mind demanded caution. The other faces were looking at him, pushing against the wall like someone behind a thick plastic sheet as they tried to break free. Joshua could see their multitudes in the dim light from the window as they pressed and receded like a tide. "Come closer, dear. It's hard to talk through this veil." He obliged, now halfway between the bed and the wall. He wanted to turn on the lights and take a better look at her face, but he was afraid that the light might ruin it. Hadn't he failed to see it until dark? He'd been sitting in this room for hours, waiting for the right time to join her. Now, here she was, coming to him in his time of need. "Wait for me, please. I'll join you. I don't want to live without you, Susan. My life is meaningless without you. Can you take me where you are? Is there some way?" "I want to apologize," she whispered, and Joshua came a little closer as her words were lost in the blare of a car horn. You have nothing to apologize for. You didn't ask to leave me. I came here to join you, to see if your spirit lingered here and I could find you once I passed on. Kara's grown. She doesn't need me. But I need you." He was closer now, and if he had reached out, he could have almost touched that porcelain face. The live wire in his head, however, that ancient alarm that warns of danger, just wouldn't stop going off, and his hands trembled as he tried to make them reach. "Not for that. I want to apologize for what I did while I was here." He felt his breath stick in his throat, his next words held in check as he waited for her to go on. In spite of himself, he crawled a little closer. "When the faces woke me up, I wasn't in bed alone. I had gone to see the nightlife, to see the city, and as I sat in one of the trendy bars, I met someone. He was charming, a real ladies' man, and one thing led to another, and I let him convince me to take him back to my hotel room. I could blame it on the wine, but I know that wasn't all of it. I was bored, dear. I felt trapped by our life, smothered by what we had built, and that's why I agreed to the job in the first place. I wanted something new, something different, and though I didn't set out to find someone else, I ended up being untrue to you." Joshua felt the ice slithering into his heart, his lungs seething as his body shook with effort. He was drowning. He was suffocating, his body refusing to draw breath. How could she do this to him? This couldn't be true. Something was messing with him. This couldn't be his wife. She would never do that. She couldn't. Even though he was left breathless by her secret, his knees still carried him forward. Please say something. Can you forgive me? It was a lapse in judgment. I'm sorry." "I don't care," he rasped. "I don't care what you've done. I forgive you. I want to be with you again." His hands slid around the edges of the mask, caressing her face as he leaned in close. "Please don't leave me. I can't live without you." He leaned his head against her mask and felt her perfect lips turn up in a smile. then let us never be parted again, my love." He felt her lips twist into a smile, too large for a human mouth to contain. The corners tore, her cheeks splitting as her mouth opened wide like a snake. He didn't struggle as her mouth enveloped him, the face elongating as she pulled him in. He opened his eyes to see that her face had grown to take in the whole wall. Her features had warped into something akin to the face of one of the demonic statues you saw in churches sometimes, and it warped and tilted oddly on that flat plane. "You aren't really my wife, are you?" "No, but I can take you to her. You'll find many of her friends inside the walls." "I hate going into this room," Maria said, her cart making a strangely chuffy noise on the carpet as she and Loa came inside. "Why? It's no different from any other room. It just always seems like something is watching me here." As she fixed the bed, Maria couldn't help but glance over her shoulder at the wall. Loa was wrong. This room was unlike anything in the hotel. The paint here always looked like faces, and the faces were always staring right at her when she came in to clean. As she looked at the wall, the paint looked thick in places, like a splash of blood left to dry. The faces leered at her from every corner, and she squinted a little as she noticed a new one. She cleaned this room once a day. The 7th floor was her assigned floor, after all, and she could have sworn that no face had been in that spot before. As she watched, it almost seemed to turn to her, the featureless face somehow regarding her. "Hello?" it rasped, its voice thick and coarse, but also inviting as it fell over her like a... "Did you say something, Maria?" Loa asked, and the little maid shook herself as she turned away from the wall. When she glanced back, the face was still there, but had become flat and featureless again. "Let's get out of here," she said suddenly, taking her cart and pushing it towards the door. "But we haven't cleaned the room yet," Loa countered, looking aghast as Maria beat a hasty retreat. Maria took the "Do Not Disturb" sign from behind the door and hung it on the knob. "We can clean tomorrow. No one will bother this room if that sign's on the door." She was glad to see Loa coming behind her, but she glanced back at the face as it regarded her from the doorway. She prayed she would have the strength to turn away tomorrow, but she knew that someday her own face might look down from that same wall. Maybe it wouldn't seem like such a bad idea on that day. Harold would never forget the strange house in the middle of the cul-de-sac. There were all sorts of rumors about that house, but most were just the stories children made up to explain strange things. The local kids said that the woman who lived there was a witch. They said that she kidnapped and ate children. They said that if you went by that house at night, you could see strange lights coming from the basement, and sometimes you could hear screams after dark. They claimed that she had lived there for years and years, and that the old woman had existed there for generations. When Harold asked his mother about these things, she said that Mrs. Renfro was just a lonely old lady who lived all alone. However, his friend Davy Parker insisted that she was a witch. If she's just a normal old lady, how come animals won't go into her house? On that, he was right. Not all animals, Harold supposed. Mostly just cats. Cats would not come anywhere near Miss Renfro's house. There were many strays on the road, cats squatting in people's yards to hunt mice or snakes, but none of them would go anywhere near Miss Renfro's house. The cats wouldn't even use the sidewalk in front of her fence. You could watch them sometimes, as they stopped at the fence line and crossed the street instead, risking being hit by traffic instead of walking near her home. It was as if there was a magnetic pulse around the place that repelled members of the feline race. She owned cats, of course. The boys had seen her take many of them into the house, all of them hissing and yowling as they battered against their carrier. Once they went in, though, they never saw any of them again. There was talk around town that the local animal shelter wouldn't give her cats anymore. They said that she'd been housing about 4 to 5 a year for as long as anyone could remember. But when a well check found that none of the cats were on the premises, they had stopped letting her foster them. That didn't stop her from getting them, though. She had traps that she set up around town and worked out a deal with the local dog catcher to bring her cats when he found them. Mr. Barley was not what you would call a nice guy. He was mean enough to dogs, and most people would believe that he would trap cats for her. His son Thomas was a big brute, known for throwing bags of animals into the local river for entertainment. He'd been picked up by the police a time or two for hurting people's pets, and that kind of behavior was usually learned from somewhere. Harold and his friends, Ralph, Stephen, and Davy, had been watching the house for as long as they could remember. Mrs. Renfro never decorated for holidays. She never handed out candy for Halloween. She never returned any of the balls or toys that might land in her yard, and chased away anyone who tried to retrieve them. No one ever went there to sell magazines or chocolate bars for school fundraisers, and if they tried, they were always chased away. Mrs. Renfro was a sour old woman, somewhere in her late 50s or early 60s, but there was talk that she might have been older than that. Harold's mother told him about how Mrs. Renfro had acted the same way when she was a kid. It couldn't have been the same Mrs. Renfro, though it does look just like her. She constantly ran kids off her property, or yelled at those who rode their bikes too close to the fence. She was a sour old crone, but this must be her daughter or a cousin or something. The Mrs. Renfro that I knew would be older than dirt by now. She told the boys this story as they sat eating watermelon on the back porch one summer, and it sparked a real fire in them. They wanted to know more about Mrs. Renfro, and in their minds, it could absolutely be the same one. Her reputation for being a wicked old witch had been cemented in the minds of most of the town's children. The idea that she had existed there for multiple generations wasn't as far-fetched as Harold's mom had thought it was. So, as they started their school break, the boys began spying on their reclusive neighbor. Like the nerd he was, Ralph wanted to start with the boring bits. "We should go to the library. We can see if they have the same Mrs. Renfro that lived there when Harold's mom was a kid." "And how are we going to do that?" Davy asked. "You know they're not going to let a bunch of kids go and look at records like that. Those kinds of things are only for lawyers and policemen." The two had argued about it, but in the end, they had decided that some good old-fashioned surveillance might be their best option. So, they had staked out the old lady's house for the next week. The boys left on their bikes around daybreak and got a good spot on Davy's front porch. Davy's house was right across from hers on the cul-de-sac and had the best view of her front yard. They stayed and watched the house until the streetlights came on, all of them racing for home before they got into trouble. The streetlights meant it was dinner time, and missing dinner would make their mothers into bigger monsters than that mean old witch, Mrs. Renfro. After 5 days, the boys hadn't seen much, besides Mrs. Renfro coming home with a new cat in a carrier. Davy was getting frustrated as the sun set on Friday afternoon. "This is stupid," he said as he threw his binoculars against the grass. "We've given up 2 perfectly good baseball games, a bike race with Mark Hollister, and a chance to go to the movies on Thursday, just to watch this old lady's house." "Well, how else do you think we're going to find anything out?" Harold asked. Davy thought about it for a minute, and then he got an idea. He went inside, and the other 3 boys heard him talking to his mother. He was using his pleading voice, the voice he put on when he was trying to convince her to give him some money or let him do something. They all knew he would manage whatever he was after. Davy's mom was a soft touch, and always had been. After a little back and forth, they heard him exclaim how much he loved her and come back outside. He had his chest puffed out as he came to join them, and a smile that made him look like the cat that had caught the canary.
Ask your parents when you get home tonight if you can stay on Saturday. I think most of the good stuff happens after dark, so we can watch from the front windows and catch it.
They all agreed, saying that sounded like a great idea. Davy's dad, a trucker who was on the road more than not, was still off on a delivery. Davy's mom was the doting sort, who loved to give her son whatever he wanted. That meant that even if they didn't catch Mrs. Renfro in anything, they could still play Super Nintendo or watch scary movies in his room. Even if they didn't solve the mystery of the neighborhood witch, it would still be a fun night. To no one's surprise, their parents agreed to let them stay the night, and as the sun began to set Saturday night, all four were in the living room with their binoculars out. Davy's mother had told them to not make too much racket and gone up to read in her bed. They were trying to be sneaky, but anyone could have seen the binoculars hiding underneath Mrs. Parker's gauzy curtains in the living room. It had been a slow day on watch, and the boys hadn't seen Mrs. Renfro leave her house all day. They supposed she might have snuck out while they were eating lunch or munching on the pizza that Davy's mom had bought them, but they doubted it. Her old van was still in the same position, and the package the postman had left that morning was still sitting on the doorstep. It had been an all-day event, and the boys almost vibrated with excitement as they watched the sun set behind her creepy old house. As darkness began to fall, Stephen said he thought he saw something from one of the basement windows. They all looked in that direction, and sure enough, there was something going on down there. A weird funhouse glow was coming from the windows, a soupy green color, like you saw in scary movies. Davy said he thought he saw smoke, too, and the longer they looked, the more the boys imagined that they could see smoke curling up from underneath the windowsill. Not the kind of smoke you got from a fire, of course. This was soft and translucent, like the smoke you saw when your mom made soup.
I knew it! I knew if we stayed past dark we'd see something.
Harold thought the glow was cool, but it wasn't really proof of anything. For all they knew, that's where she kept her TV, and she was just watching something weird. Maybe she was down there smoking the stuff that he caught his sister puffing on behind the house, and they were watching no more than her relaxing after a long day of being terrible. Either way, the glow wasn't much proof of anything.
We need to get closer,
someone said. It wasn't until Harold found the other three looking at him that he realized he had been the one to say it.
That's a great idea, Davy said, putting down his binoculars.
He looked pretty excited about the prospect of sneaking up on the old woman's house, but Harold suddenly wished he hadn't said anything. Mrs. Renfro's house was creepy enough in the daytime, and the idea of going over her fence at night was a little too spooky for him.
It was just a thought, guys. If she caught us sneaking over there after dark, she'd have we can go out the back and creep around the side of the house, Davy said, clearly not listening. My mom will never hear the door and think we've just gone up to my room if she comes downstairs.
Stephen and Ralph were all for it, though Harold thought Ralph looked a little queasy. Just to be safe, they all went running up the stairs like a herd of gazelles to get their flashlights from their backpack. They had all brought them with the idea of telling scary stories later that night, but they might be put to better use now. Once they had them, they snuck back downstairs as quietly as they could and managed to make their way out the back door. There was still a little stab of daylight left as they came through Davy's backyard and around the front of the house. As they crossed the street in a mad hustle, it dipped below the horizon and left them in darkness, at least until the streetlights came on in a small flurry of snapping bulbs. They stood beneath one of the lamplights, crouching low as they observed the front of Mrs. Renfro's house. The front lawn was covered in tall grass and weeds, children's toys dotting it like pirate treasure. From behind all the tall grass,
They could see the green glow as it came from the small windows. The boys hopped the low fence as they snuck through the hip-high grass and up to the windows. As they lay on their bellies and looked down through those slats, Harold could see that Mrs. Renfro was not, in fact, watching TV and relaxing after a long day. What they saw seemed to be better proof that she was a witch. The basement looked identical to the one in Harold's house. A single steep staircase ran down into a concrete room with shelves and hooks on the wall. The floor, a flat sheet of concrete. Instead of a washer, a dryer, and a mound of holiday decorations, however, a large metal pot sat in the middle of the floor. The pot, more like a bathtub than a soup pot, was the source of the green glow, and the liquid inside swirled with eldritch light. Mrs. Renfro was stirring it with a long spoon or maybe a broom handle, and though her mouth was moving, none of them could tell what she was saying. On a shelf near the pot was the cat they had seen her bring in a few days before.
"Holy crap," whispered Ralph, pushing away from the window. "She really is a witch."
Harold nodded, all of them moving back from the window so she couldn't see them. But Davy stayed put. He was focused on that cat, the one on the shelf that she was clearly planning to do something with. Harold didn't really like how intent he was. Davy was prone to doing things that weren't strictly smart sometimes, things that might be considered noble if they weren't so suicidal. Last summer, Davy had saved a kid from drowning at Gopher Pond, an act that had almost sent him under as well. The year before, he had shoved a kid out of the way of a truck, earning himself a broken arm and a commendation from the mayor. Davy didn't lack for courage. Sometimes he lacked for sense, though. When he picked up the rock, Harold was afraid that he might throw it through the little window and give them away. Instead, he rolled like a log and tossed it at Miss Renfro's front door. The old woman stiffened, climbing down off her stool as she hobbled towards the stairs on her gouty legs.
"What are you doing?"
Harold whispered, looking at Davy incredulously.
"Getting that cat,"
Davy said. As she got to the top of the stairs, he pushed the window and grinned as it popped inward. He slid inside as Ralph began to hyperventilate, and Stephen asked what the heck he thought he was doing. Harold whispered he didn't know, but quieted as the front door came open and a quavery voice cascaded across the lawn.
"Who is it?"
she croaked, sounding more like a bullfrog than a woman.
"What nasty beasties are taking me from my work?"
The three boys got as low as they could in that tall grass, hoping it would cover them as the specter descended the steps.
"Are you hiding?"
she rasped, the stairs squeaking under her feet as her bunched old legs brought her closer to the yard. Harold put a hand over Ralph's mouth as his wheezing became louder. He undoubtedly needed his inhaler, but the sound of its trigger would alert the old biddy. Stephen had begun to shimmy a little, trying to get around the edge of the house, but as her patent leather shoe came down with a clump on the cobblestone path in front of her, he froze like a statue. If she had a flashlight, they'd be seen, but Harold didn't think she had one. She hadn't turned on the porch light either, and with any luck, her old eyes wouldn't see them if they stayed absolutely still. She took a step into the grass, and Harold almost pulled his hand away as he felt Ralph's tears touch his skin. She took another, and Harold thought she might be casting a spell before he realized it was just Stephen, quietly praying. She took a third step, and Harold shut his eyes tight as he hoped beyond hope that she wouldn't see them. The seconds slipped on for an indeterminate time, but finally she turned and hobbled back up the stairs. When the door closed, They all breathed a sigh of relief before pulling back to the window to see if Davy had been caught. Not only had Davy not been caught, but as they caught sight of him, he was lifting the cat carrier off the shelf. He had taken the stepladder that the witch had been standing on and was reaching on tiptoes to grasp the side of the cat carrier. None of them could hear if the cat was cooperating, but it didn't look as if Davy was going to manage to get the cage off the shelf without dropping it. Harold had just shimmied to go help him when the croak of the witch brought him up short and sealed Davy's fate.
"What in the hell do you think you're doing?"
she screeched, and Davy must have jumped because he was suddenly falling towards the tub of glowing liquid. The cat carrier fell to the concrete with a smack, and a small white animal shot out like a cannonball as it tore off towards the upstairs. It ran right between the startled legs of the crone, but she was more interested in the boy that was now bobbing in her cauldron. They both began to scream simultaneously. Mrs. Renfro doubled over, falling down the stairs as she clutched at her stomach. She was still when she came to rest on the concrete, but Harold could see her twitching as whatever was happening took effect. The tub could not have been deeper than a foot or two, but Davy was suddenly splashing like a drowning man. He was shrinking, his skin growing taut and spotted, his hair growing gray and brittle. His teeth fell out, floating in the soup before dissolving into nothing. His eyes joined them, his skeletal hands still grasping at hope. As they watched, their friend shuddered out a last few moments of his life, his body dissolving as he sank into the tub. They ran screaming from the yard, thundering into Davy's house as they went to find the closest adult they could. The police were there before they could finish telling it all, and the 4 squad cars lit up the cul-de-sac like a Christmas light show. Harold's father was amongst them, being one of the deputies for their little town, which was how Harold found out more than he strictly wanted to the next day. Harold had gone home with his mother, Mrs. Parker speaking with the police as she begged them to find her son. He had gone to sleep on the couch under the scratchy afghan his mother had crocheted, and dreamed about the pool of liquid in Mrs. Renfro's basement. In the dream, Davy's skeleton had burst out of it as he stood beside the cauldron, grabbing him and trying to drag him in. It screamed and screamed, his ears ringing with it, and when he tossed and turned his way off the couch, he awoke to find his mother and father talking in the kitchen. Old Biddy was kinda nuts. She had all these books and diagrams, satanic stuff. She had this big tub of liquid down there. The coroner thinks it's acid or something, but they aren't really sure. He paused, and Harold almost heard the shudder in his father's voice. They found bone fragments at the bottom of the tub. They aren't sure, but they think they might be human. Did they find any sign of Davy? His mother asked. Not really. They can't be sure that the bone fragments are his, but if the boy's story's right, I guess they'd have to be. I hope that terrible woman rots in prison, his mother half whispered, expressing more venom in her words than Harold had ever heard from her before. Not unless we find her, he said unhappily. She was gone when we arrived. How far could she have gotten? She'd have to be pushing 100. I don't know, but the journals I found will stick with me for a long time. He shuddered a little, and Harold peeked around the corner of the couch to snoop on his parents. She was killing cats. She talked about how she would drown them in that tub and steal their lives. Steal their lives? Cats were supposed to have 9 lives. She was stealing their lives to stay alive. She was so delusional. She thought the cats were keeping her from dying. The journal entries went way, way back, long before you and I were born. She was a sick woman who believed she'd lived for centuries. Mrs. Renfro's house sat empty for a long time. The families that moved in never stayed for long.
They always said the same thing. They told the realtor that the house was lovely, but they felt watched while they were there. The toys disappeared from the yard, reclaimed by their owners, but Harold and his friends never returned to that house again. Davy's family moved away a few months after his disappearance. His mother couldn't deal with the loss of her son, and his house was soon occupied by a new family. Time went on. Harold and his friends returned to school. People forgot about Davy and Mrs. Renfro. A news story began to circulate, though, as the stories always do. Kids claimed to see a young woman walking the streets at night. She would lure children away, singing to them and telling them how she wanted to play. She was said to be luring more than a few teens away as well, though Harold doubted she had offered to play with them. There were reports of people missing, but never enough to spark much panic. They could be chalked up to runaways or kids lost in the woods, and the town continued. Harold knew that they were more than stories, though. He saw the woman outside his window most nights, he and Stephen and Ralph. She called to them, telling them to come and play. She told them that Davy missed them, and they could see him again if they wanted. When they refused her or ignored her, she would go into the woods behind their houses, disappearing into the shadows. Sometimes they could see a strange green glow from the woods late at night. Harold wondered how many years Mrs. Renfro had gotten from Davy, and how many more she would get before the town finally put an end to her.